One of the unintended consequences of the war in Ukraine is that Europe and USA have gotten closer. And it is no coincidence that Europe is strongly represented here today. Another consequence of the war is an energy crisis which is especially looming in Europe. In 2021, year before the war broke out, 40% of Europe's gas was supplied by Russia. Today, a lot of that is replaced by LNG from the USA. We are also witnessing an increased speed of green transition in Europe. More than ever, we need to gather to find solutions to the questions that we have ahead of us. And that is exactly why we are here today, to discuss about new partnerships between Europe and the Arctic. We are also here to discuss how the Arctic can serve as a potential source of solutions and to discuss what is needed to get us there. And I'm really delighted to have with me a distinguished panel. Ambassador Emilie Haber, Ambassador of Germany to the United States, Ambassador Thomas Winkler, Senior Arctic Official from the Kingdom of Denmark, Deputy Ambassador Michael Curtis, Delegation of the European Union to the United States, then Deputy Chief of Mission Adam Siewuszonski, Embassy of the Republic of Poland in the US, Deputy Chief of Mission Markus Särklep, Embassy of Estonia in the US, and Ambassador Morten Høglund, Senior Arctic Official of Norway. A record number of European officials are here at the Arctic Encounter Symposium. Do you see an increased interest in or awareness of the Arctic in your home countries or in your institutions? Ambassador Haber, would you like to get us started?
I wasn't wearing my glasses, so I couldn't even see how to switch on the mic. So the answer is a clear yes. Although it's fair to note that Germany has, as far as Germany is concerned, there's a long-standing interest in the Arctic, mostly coming from science and research. We've been invested there very strongly as early as the early days of the 20th century, and that was a continuous effort. You will remember the Mosaic effort, the largest ever polar expedition, which was under German lead, the Polarstern, and really recovered a trove of data that scientists across the world are now evaluating. But over the past, shall we say, 25 years, you can note a significant increase. Germany became became observer to the Arctic Council 25 years ago. The first Arctic guidelines, only as late as 2013, rewritten in 2019, and even now you can see they will have to be rewritten given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what I tried to say, there are two reasons for an incredible increase of the interest. The one, obviously, is climate change with the melting of the ice sheets, the borealization, the huge opportunities, but also threats that come with it, and that will have an enormous impact on the rest of the world. It's not the Arctic that is triggering the climate change, but the Arctic is really suffering from the climate change that has evolved and will possibly we'll see triggering rippling effects of the way the Arctic is concerned in the rest of the world. And Germany, as being one of the most globalized countries in the world, obviously we do take a great interest.
Thank you, Ambassador. How about the European Union aspect? Michael.
Thank you, Anu, and pleasure to be back on this stage. Along the lines of the German ambassador, the interest from the EU for the Arctic is growing, but it's certainly not new, and the challenges aren't new. 3 of our member states are Arctic states, Sweden, Finland and Denmark. That's 400,000 European citizens living in the Arctic. So, we feel like we are part of the Arctic. So, it's been said the Arctic does affect the European Union, but what happens in the European Union also affects the Arctic. in a positive way and a negative way. Sometimes it's negative in terms of our own pollution footprint, but in a positive way in the leading role that we've been taken to address climate change via specifically the European Green Deal. And I think our work generally on trying to protect the environment and protect biodiversity, of course, we do this in very close cooperation with our member states, but also in regional multilateral fora. We work very closely, of course, with the other Arctic states, Norway, the European ones, Iceland, and of course Greenland as well. So it's very important for us. We do have a strategy from 2021 which looks to have a safe, stable, sustainable, peaceful and prosperous Arctic. We have an ambassador for the Arctic, and it's very much an area that we're engaged in.
Thank you, Michael. Green Deal we'll get back to later on. Adam, what about the Polish perspective?
Yes, thank you so much. It's also great to be back on stage. Just like in the case of Germany and the EU, Poland has traditionally been very interested in the Arctic. Already in 1957, we have established our first permanent base in Svalbard, and the scientific research has always been at the center of our interest, and we always understood, as it has been said so many times during this conference, that what happens in the Arctic doesn't necessarily stay in the Arctic. So our interest was in the scientific research, but also in all things related to climate change, environment, and unfortunately, since February 24 of last year, also in terms of geopolitics and this increasingly aggressive conduct of the Russian Federation, both in Europe and also in Arctic. Poland became an observer state in the same group of countries together with Germany in 1998, so 25 years ago. We have facilitated informal dialogue between the current presidency and the observer states within the so-called Warsaw format established in 2010. And we remain committed to Arctic Council. We support the Norwegian presidency that is supposed to start shortly in a couple of weeks, and also the Norwegian presidency goals. And speaking of the EU and its role in the Arctic, I just want to also say that from our perspective, it is very important that the EU finally gets its full observer status at the Arctic Council. This is a long overdue step, but a necessary one, given how extensive the EU's engagement in the Arctic is.
And then another aspiring observer to the Arctic Council, Estonia. Margus, how do you see it?
Thank you. It's also a pleasure and a great honor to be included in this panel. And perhaps the first part of the question, what connects us to the Arctic, is plain to see. The Arctic expeditions from Estonia have reached also these parts almost 200 years ago. In an earlier conversation today, the name Kotzebue came up. He is from Estonia. And this brings us back to a time when these parts and Estonia were equally part of the Russian Empire. In the more modern terms, we in 1926 we acceded to the Svalbard Agreement, and the popular interest in the issues of Arctic and high north in Russia have been more related to the situation and plight of the natives. Our brothers and sisters, that Finno-Ugric peoples in the high north of Russia. With all the changes that are happening in the high north, though, we are very keenly aware of the challenges. The climate change that happens is one that requires extensive scientific approach. And in Estonia, we have been very involved in that, in polar research. but it also brings with it opportunities. So I was very pleased to hear Madam Minister's comments earlier. When you ride the public buses in Nuuk, the ticket validation system that you see there is provided by an Estonian company. There are different ways that we can both contribute and participate in finding the ways to cooperate. And of course, being close to the Arctic Circle, to the Arctic region, my capital is actually north of Juneau, Alaska.
Thank you, Markus. I would now like to bring in the Arctic ambassadors, Ambassador Winkler. We are living in the midst of times of disruption. What role do you see non-Arctic stakeholders playing in the international Arctic collaboration?
Well, thank you for that question. I know that sort of forces me to start by referring to the Ilulissat 2008 and 2018 declaration stating very clearly that the responsibility for the management of the Arctic rests with the Arctic states, of course with the inclusion of the peoples of the Arctic, including the indigenous peoples. This said, Denmark of course welcomes all actors to the Arctic who comes with a positive agenda for the development of the Arctic. And this is why, at least my country, are very pleased with the updated EU communication on the Arctic from October 21, because the main thrust of this communication is to bring all of the EU policies in play to an even larger extent in the Arctic. And I think the examples that Minister Motzfeldt used this just a little while ago on how the EU is implementing its policy on support for education and green transition in Greenland is a very good example of how the EU is coming in with a positive agenda. So anyone, states, organizations, NGOs, who comes in with that positive agenda are of course welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a great message. Then I would like to turn to Ambassador Höglund. You will take over the chairship of Arctic Council in May this year. How does the Norwegian chairship intend to work with observers and non-Arctic states during your 2 years of chairship?
Yes, thank you, Anne, for that question. Yes, it's challenge for us now to take over the chair of the Arctic Council, something we are looking forward to and preparing for. And the Arctic Council family, of course, includes the observers, which we appreciate their interest and participation in projects and in working groups, especially where they play a very vital role. And we've already heard here many of the examples of what observer countries bring to the discussion, and not least expertise and scientific knowledge of Arctic. So for us Arctic states, it is quite vital that we have the dedication of observers. We intend to have close interaction with observers. And I'm saying this because in these circumstances, the work of the Arctic Council, we have high hopes, high ambitions, but it will not be business as usual. So we have to find some different types of mechanisms to manage the work given this unique situation we are in and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that said, we also must make sure that all participants in the Arctic Council family can have a relevant role to play and be included at appropriate levels of, so no one is excluded, and that includes the observers. I also want to say to prospective observers or other countries that there are ways to engage with the Arctic family. There are several in academics, in science, but also on local government issues and for young people. And a range of different organizations and ways to engage your institutions or your governments in different types of cooperation. So it's just a matter of finding the right connections. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So you're basically not required to be an observer in order to engage. One of the messages that has, at least in my view, been highlighted here is the need for a transition. Michael, you mentioned Green Deal. Europe is going through a green transition. As I started my notes off with, the war in Ukraine has led to a speeding up of that process. And simultaneously, the European Union is committed to spearheading the fight against climate change with relatively ambitious goals, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. But what policy measures do spur this green transition, and how do they impact the Arctic?
Well, two things here. First of all, the European Union was committed, and member states were committed to transition and to achieving a climate neutral reality in Europe. But there's no doubt that the Russian war has sped that up. It has, at the outset you mentioned that European countries were, as an average, dependent on Russian fossil fuels, you mentioned gas, by 40% before Russia's war of aggression. Well, in the German case, it was 55%, and 35% of oil, and 50% of our coal came from Russia. It's now 0%. And all of that shows you that we needed to transit to renewable energies at a much quicker pace than we had originally intended. It will include, for some periods, some transitional energies as well, but it has accelerated the overall transition. And to sum it up, there are probably two reasons that in general will facilitate an acceleration of a transition to renewables. One is a changed sense of urgency, which has happened as a consequence of the Russian aggression. And the second is you need good business cases in order to convince populations and individuals that it really makes sense to transit. Yesterday evening, I met with young entrepreneurs who are invested in the field of renewable energies in the Arctic. And what they explained to me was how they actually had success in convincing people on solar energy and on wind energy by making the case, by convincing communities and creating corporate interests in the transition. So the argument was, it's a business case and it works, which may not be so easy to make as a case in a region that is so highly dependent on fossil fuels and where the business case to date had been, it works. But the other case works as well.
So economic rationale. Michael, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, thanks, Anu. I mean, just to add to what the German ambassador said, we also heard the foreign minister from Greenland also talk about how EU money is helping fund the green transition in Greenland, for example. We have, for example, various programs, the Sustainable Blue Economy Partnership, working with Arctic countries, and also in terms of research and science, also mentioned by the German ambassador. But within the EU, a lot of that effort is internal. It's passing legislation. It's also winning hearts and minds. It's public diplomacy is a large part of what we're doing. There is an external element to it which goes beyond our borders. For example, we're working on a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is one, so we're not basically put at a disadvantage because of the measures that we're trying to take as EU to reduce emissions globally. But you know, the European Union is the world's largest single market, 440 million people. With the US, we have the biggest trade and investment relationship in the world. We have a free trade agreement with Canada. So, you know, with Arctic states which aren't part of Europe, we are working very much together. We're very, of course, closely interested in what the US is doing on the Inflation Reduction Act, which, of course, is fundamentally a climate policy as well. So it's really underpin everything that we're doing at the moment, in addition, of course, to supporting Ukraine against the Russian aggression in its country.
You mentioned something that triggered me, namely winning the hearts and minds. And in Europe, we're now in a situation where we are facing relatively, or actually very high energy prices. How do you explain that to the population, for example, in Poland or in Estonia? How do we win their hearts and minds? And perhaps Adam and Margus would like to take that.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think winning hearts and minds, you see what Russians are doing in places like Bucha in Ukraine. I think that, that's very important. And also, I just think there is a really acute awareness of the existential crisis that climate change is to the planet amongst Europeans generally. Sorry.
Thank you.
No, thank you for these comments, Michael. You're quite right. When we talk about the level of inflation in this country or in any other, and the high energy prices, then there are a few figures that I would like to throw at you. At the height of last summer, we had inflation rate in Estonia of 25%, mostly caused by the effects of the war. There was a moment in August where 1 kilowatt hour cost $4, and at the pump we pay about twice as much as most U.S. consumers do. Yet you don't see any people protesting on the streets. The way my prime minister has expressed it, this is a war tax. And this is cheap. We're paying it in euros and cents, dollars, while the Ukrainians are paying it with their lives and in blood. So there is perhaps a greater willingness to stand up for our principles, because we've seen what happens both these days in Bucha and Mariupol with kids and other people being deported to Russia. These are things that we have experienced both in Estonia, in Poland, but also after the Second World War in different parts of Germany. I think there's an acute awareness of that. At the same time, when we're talking about the green transition, then I would only want to underline the words that Ambassador Haber was saying, that it makes economic sense. With the increase of renewable energy, there are moments where the energy price actually becomes negative. There is already so much in production that it actually makes only a good business sense to be invested in that.
Yes, thank you, Anu. Just like Margus has said already, it's also in the Polish case that people understand the cost of freedom. They understand that the Ukrainians are also fighting for our values, for our security and safety. So it's not a comfortable situation. To the contrary, we've been also very severely hit by this energy crisis and energy inflation in Poland. But what is important beyond that, I think, is to keep in mind that this last winter has been relatively mild in terms of temperatures, and European storage capacity was in a pretty good place last year already, because our storages in many countries were filled to a certain extent with Russian gas when we still imported natural gas from Russia. And it is this coming winter and potentially also the one after next that might be more challenging for Europe. And this is where the United States comes into equation, and potentially Alaska at some point. As I understand, Alaska is planning to build an LNG terminal right here, to be able to export also LNG to Europe. So again, we are very committed to our green energy goals and the energy transition, but in the meantime, we're going to need a reliable energy partner, and the US has proven to be such a partner for Europe. And before the war, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but we used to import 18 billion cubic meters of LNG from the United States as the EU. Right now it's 3 times as much, 54 BCMs a year. And in the coming years, it seems that we are going to need more. So this is also something that is crucial for Warsaw.
Thank you. I would like to turn back to the Arctic ambassadors here, because NIMBYism, not in my backyard, is something that has also reached the Nordic part of the Arctic. Development of renewables is possible in the Arctic. We know that the potential is massive, but it is also visible. It has consequences for subsistence herding, traditional livelihoods, and it challenges some of the existing livelihoods and business lines. Considering that process and considering that the Nordics are well underway in decarbonization, do you have any takeaways or best practices based on your experience as to how one can drive this process forward in the Arctic?
You didn't take the bait, Morten?
Happy to listen to you, Thomas.
I'm not quite. I must say, I'm not quite sure what the answer is. So as a true diplomat, I would answer something completely different. I mean, I'm not that concerned about public opinion. I think we've also heard why public opinion in regard to green transition is on top and rising. I'm more concerned about the need to take bold political decisions, and I'm looking at the EU as well. I mean, and I think Minister Motzfeldt was much too modest. I mean, I think that the government of Greenland has taken some very good political decisions on green transition, including the hydro power projects and Power to X, and I think that should be something that we all should be inspired by. But I also think, and I heard several of my colleagues up here mention business case. I think often in the Arctic is a business case plus. It may not be a purely winner as a pure business case, but you need something additional because the conditions of the Arctic are complicated or difficult. So that would require politicians to say, we're ready to invest that, let's say, extra to get the minerals that we need from the green transition out of the Arctic. And of course, you're right, there are also in the Arctic, as elsewhere, but especially in the Arctic, environmental concerns, concern about traditional way of life. They also have to be taken into account. So in many ways, it requires not only bold political business plus decisions, but also some extra considerations if the care has to be taken in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Höglund.
Yes, thank you. The environment in the Arctic is vulnerable. Everything relating to this kind of transition, even if it's green transition, it requires usually some kind of steps which will, construction in nature. And that can go against the interest of indigenous people, of traditional interest. We have examples of this in Norway. The Norwegian government has been brought to court and lost in the Supreme Court over a wind project which affected the traditional way of reindeer husbandry. So one could think that wind power is good, and to some degree it is, but it has consequences. So everything that we do in this regard must be done in close consultation with all affected, of course. I believe we, as states, there are challenges in this, and one can only learn as we go forward, but I think we can also learn from each other. And also, in the name of green transition, only because you call it green transition, it doesn't necessarily mean the end result will be positive for everybody. So people can have a different view on this. So it's a learning that consultation, involvement, and taking time to really try to get this right is key. And sometimes it goes completely wrong, as we have seen some examples of. Thank you.
Thank you for being honest. Now, moving over to the questions that we've received from the audience. I'd like to start with the one on the top. So how do you see the continued and accelerating impacts of climate change influencing the relationships among northern countries? Anyone? So how does...
I'm not sure. I'm not a northern country as such, so I'm not sure if I'm well qualified to answer this. But I would like to say, in this respect, climate change, is what we see as a challenge, an environmental, human, of course, but it's also a security challenge as well. It's changing the perspectives in the north with the possibility of opening up of sea routes, for example, and mineral resource exploitation. What we do see is that this brings opportunities, but also brings many risks. And although we're also committed to the Arctic stand as an area of low tension, I think we see it as much as a threat is the possibility of importing conflicts elsewhere. So you have a spillover in the Arctic as well. So all this together is rather combustible. It's rather dangerous, and I think it just really underlines the importance of us working together. Of course, primary responsibility with the 8 Nordic states, but also working together with other partners to address these challenges.
Ambassador?
Well, it's a bit unclear to me what the definition of northern countries, as we had in the question, but what I would say, at least among the Nordic countries, there's a very, very close cooperation already on enormous amounts of areas, and climate change has been on this agenda for a long time. I think it's perhaps, if you remember back to yesterday, our colleague from Singapore, who certainly was affected very, very, almost directly by the climate change also coming from the north. And I think that's perhaps the more interesting question. How does climate change influence the cooperation between the north, to use that expression, and countries all over the globe who are hit by climate change? And perhaps we can find a common denominator there and a stronger cooperation, not only with formal observers to the Arctic Council, but with all countries, states and regions who are affected by climate change. Thank you.
Margus, a quick comment. Time is running up.
Yes, thank you. No, I think that it causes countries in general to cooperate much closer. And jumping ahead, I think I saw a question on observer countries. I think what the current geopolitical situation has done, it also has clarified a much more principled division between countries that support the rules-based world order and autocracies and such. I think this crystallizes our responsibility to keep up the rules-based world order.
Thank you. So we have heard that climate change is a global concern. It is definitely a concern also outside the Arctic, even though we see the impacts most clearly in our region. That explains parts of the great interest from the outside stakeholders when it comes to our region. We need a transition, but one essential point in the transition is winning over the hearts and minds, or making the economic case for people so that we're actually able to go through it. We also need bold political decisions going forward. And when we make those bold political decisions, we need consultations, involvement, and enough time. Please join me in giving a great hand to these experts.